Good morning, everyone. My name is Josiah Ilgenfritz. I'm the Senior Solution Architects for our Professional Services team here at Decisions. This morning, we're doing a series on lessons learned from various departments, what we've seen as we've been working in Decisions, building in Decisions, using Decisions. And this morning, I'm talking about rock-solid deployments, things that we've seen as we've built projects and deployed them for customers, and lessons that we've learned and how that can impact how you deploy, how you build to get to that deployment to ensure that when you have that project up and running in production, that everything is as solid as it can be. So we've broken down deployment into 4 stages, and you'll notice that these stages aren't all deployment. First of all, there's things that you need to do while you're actually building your project to ensure a solid deployment, a solid deliverable. After you build your project, you need to test it. You need to make sure that everything is working the way that you think that it should before you push that code into production. If you've built a bunch of flows, you've built a bunch of forms, you want to validate that those things do what you think they should do before you release them into the wild, before you start actually having real live data flowing through them. It's important to make sure you're testing them. Next, you actually need to deploy the thing that you've built. How do you take that thing that's sitting on your development server and move it into your production server? And finally, after you've actually deployed, everything is now running live in production, validating that everything is transferred smoothly, that everything is running as expected, and that the system isn't encountering errors. So let's dive a little bit into what that looks like as we're talking through the process. So first of all, building out. We're going to cover a couple things here when we talk about building. Some best practices that we recommend around building. Now, these are limited to best practices specifically for building to help ensure a solid deployment. If I were talking about best practices building in Decisions in general, I would be here for a really, really long time. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about error handling. How error handling comes into play, how error handling can be incorporated into your projects, and how error handling plays a part in the deployment cycle. And then finally, part of that build process, best practices around building to ensure that your deployment goes well, code reviews, making sure that the things that you're building are being reviewed, both from a peer level, from the perspective of are the flows themselves built well? Do they meet best practices? From a project level, does the project as a whole work together? And from a larger application level, does the entire thing that we're building work the way that we think that it should? So let's dive into that a little bit. When we're talking about best practices, what do we mean? So specifically here, let's start by talking about kind of the elephant in the room with Decisions when it comes to deploying. Projects versus applications. Decisions has a thing called a project that isn't the same as what a lot of people think about when they talk about their overall project that they're building. So making sure that we kind of understand the term project in the context of what Decisions means is going to be really, really important to making sure that the deployment goes well. So let's start with an application. An application is when you're coming to Decisions and you say, we have this thing that we want to build. Whatever that process is, we want to build an HR application that has parts for onboarding new employees, and it should have some things that hook into payroll, and it should have, all of the things that you would want in an HR system. That's the application. That's the thing that we're building. When that comes to kind of Decisions terms, Decisions then has the concept of a project. And the Decisions, a project is a deployable thing. You can think about a project, a Decisions project, as like a deployment item or a deployment package. Decisions says a project is a set of items that we are going to deploy at a time. So this will be your folders, your flows, your forms, your rules, your reports, all of that stuff is tied to a project. But it's important to note that there can be, and often should be, a distinction between the application you're building as a whole and the projects that you're organizing for deployment. If I'm building a massive HR system, I don't want to have to deploy everything in that application at the same time. If I've got various components, I may say, well, I'm working on the customer onboarding module, and I want to deploy that independently of the payroll part of the module, right? Those two things, they both feed into the application. They're both part of the HR process, but the components aren't tied to each other in a way that I can deploy my onboarding and I can deploy my payroll independently of each other, which means that I can be working on the payroll part of things, AJ can be working on the onboarding part of things, and AJ can do some work, he can check it in, and he doesn't have to worry about accidentally deploying the work that I'm doing because they're not in the same project. So making sure that your components are tied to different projects, even if they're the same application. As you can see up here, like an application can be made up of multiple decisions projects. So thinking through when you start building, organizing, anytime that you have a singular function that you may want to deploy independently of other functionalities of the overall application, break those into individual projects. One of the things that we've seen that can often cause a problem is you start building out your HR application, and you start building and you deploy, and you've got your first piece into production, and that's great, everything's working fine. But as that project grows, or that application grows over time, and more functionality is added, now, 5 years later, I come in and I need to make a change. I don't want to have to deploy the thousands and thousands of items that are now tied to this application because they're all in one project. I just want to deploy my piece. So I want to make sure that it's organized so that my piece is its own self-contained project within that application. I can deploy it. I don't have to search through all of the different components and find the 5 things that have been modified that need to get transferred over. It makes that deployment process much easier. Next, I want to talk a little bit about, while you're building with the data that you're going to see in mind. In development, it's really easy to start building, build out dashboards, build out flows, build out reports, all of the things, and everything looks like it's working smoothly. You get it all working, you get it all tested, you push it into production. 6 months from now, the customer suddenly says, hey, everything has gotten incredibly slow all of a sudden. We don't know what happened. Everything was working fine. Suddenly, nothing works the way that we expected anymore. And what can happen is that you've built a system, you've tested the system, but you've built that system with the small amount of data that you often have in development. You don't have your full data set that you would see in a live production environment. And you've done all of your testing around that small amount of data. It gets into production, it's running fine. The system starts building up data, and you start finding those areas where the system isn't as performant as it could be because it's never been tuned against a large data set. So what we recommend is that as you're building, as you're developing, set up your data, set up your, all of your data objects, and then dump a bunch of test dummy data into the system so that you can see how the system is going to respond if there are 5 million records in the tables. What this allows you to do is, one, immediately see if you have dashboards or reports or tiles or things that are displaying data to a user that aren't going to perform well at a high volume of data, but it also allows you to identify bad data patterns in flows as you're building. If I'm building a flow and I have some steps to import data, fetch data into the thing, and I've got some bad criteria on my fetches so that I pull data in and it's not limiting the data the way that I think that it should. If I've got 10 rows of data in my table, I may not notice it as I'm testing because I only expect 10 rows of data. If I expect 10 rows of data and I've got 500,000 rows of data in my tables and I run the flow, I'm going to notice that I've accidentally pulled in 500,000 rows of data instead of 10 rows of data. But I can't notice that unless I actually have all of that data actually stored in my database. So as you're building, build out your data types, build a flow to just import a bunch of dummy data, have it stored in your tables, have it stored in your data types, and then you can see, as you're developing, the impact that that data is going to have on the process as you're building, and it can drive your design decisions because you can easily tune on the fly, oh, I've built this flow there's some kind of bad pattern here because I'm getting way more data coming in than I think that I should be. What's going on? Let's find that logic now, rather than, hey, we built this thing, we tested it, it looks good, put it into production, suddenly we're getting way more data coming through the process than we expected. So add in a lot of extra data into your data types in development so that you can see how the system is going to respond to that amount of data. Up next, let's talk about error handling. Error handling is a subject that I am super passionate about. I could spend hours and hours and hours just talking about error handling. Actually, when I was asked to do the presentation, I said, okay, cool, I'll present on error handling. And they said, well, let's take it up a little bit high level. But anyone on the professional services team can tell you that I will and have talked for hours about error handling. It's really important, and I'm really passionate about making sure that the things we build have solid error handling incorporated in them. I'm going to talk about it just at a high level today. The things that I really want to talk about isn't necessarily the implementation, all of the different ways that you can put error handling into something, but really the philosophy to keep in mind as you're thinking through how should I put error handling into the thing that I'm building. There's three main things to keep in mind. First of all, the end user experience. Second, how are you storing off those errors? And third, what happens in that process after an error occurs, right? So end user experience. If I'm coming in, I'm the business user, I don't know anything about what's happening in the background. I'm just here to fill out a form and put some data into the system. If something goes wrong, I don't want to see a full stack trace telling me, the .NET of what failed in the thing. It's meaningless to me. That's not helpful to me, right? So making sure that the end user experience has a user-friendly message to say, hey, something went wrong here. We've alerted the people that need to know about this so that they know that something went wrong. But I should see a message as a user that says, hey, something went wrong in here. We weren't able to submit this. The data didn't get saved. You need to rerun the process, or something along those lines to alert the user that something has in fact gone wrong. Because what you don't also want to do, right? You don't want to overwhelm the user with information that is not useful to them. But you also don't want to fail silently. If I submit a form and the form doesn't actually go through, the data doesn't get saved, but I don't see any indication that something's gone wrong in the process, it's reasonable for me to assume that the process has worked correctly and that I don't need to worry about it anymore, right? I don't need to go back and resubmit the form because I submitted the form and nothing told me that I didn't actually submit it. So it's important to make sure that there is some indication to the user. The process shouldn't just fail silently, but the message that they receive should be something that's useful to them, that's helpful to them, that tells them, hey, restart this, or this part failed, you're going to need to do X, Y steps to mitigate the process, right? How do they need to proceed as a user? But don't overwhelm them, but don't hide the error from them completely either. Right? Number two, recording errors. Anytime that someone comes to our support team and says, hey, this process failed, we got a message that said something went wrong, help us fix it. And the first thing that our support team does is say, okay, cool, can you send us the logs? We need to actually see what happened in the system. A message that says an error occurred doesn't allow us to troubleshoot or to help you troubleshoot or allow you to troubleshoot what went wrong in the process. So making sure that at some level, any error in the system is recorded, right? If you put no error handling into a process at all, Decisions will give you that pop-up with the red icon at the X, and it'll give you the stack trace of the error. But it'll also write it into the decisions logs, so that you can go in there and you can see what happened at that timestamp. Once you start putting your own custom error handling in, as soon as you put a catch exception step into the flow, decision says, all right, cool, you're handling this, I don't have to, and it won't log it. So the first thing that your error handling process needs to do is record that error in some way. I always recommend any error handling that you build always should have a log step. It's one of the most low-level things that Decisions does. It allows you to write that log into the files, read it later, figure out what happened. Another thing that I recommend is actually building some type of structure to help hold that error so that you can record over time errors that have occurred in your process, but not just what errors have occurred, what the resolution was to that error. How did you fix it? Is it still outstanding? Give you a way to track, build assignments around, and monitor what errors have occurred in the system, how often they've occurred, and what's been done to make those errors stop happening or to fix the ones that are currently open. So not only do you have a record of the errors that are coming through the system and saying, hey, here's things that we need to fix, but you have a historical context of errors that have come through the system and how those errors have been resolved. And finally, point number 3 here, what happens next in the process, right? We've built the process, it's running, someone's done a thing, the system has done a thing, something's gone wrong, we've recorded the error, but now what happens, right? We don't want the process to just end. Maybe we do. Sometimes we do want the process to end. We say something's gone wrong, we've recorded it, we've created an assignment to someone to go fix the thing, and we're just going to end the process here, right? Maybe we've got some type of batch automation process, and we're saying for some records, if it fails, we just end that part of the process and move on, right? Someone's going to need to do this bulk upload again tomorrow, and then hopefully they'll have fixed the data. The process is complete. Sometimes we don't want the process to end. Let's say we've got a months-long approval process that has 50 different approvals in it. It goes from department to department to department. It takes overall 12 months to run the process all the way through. We get to month 9 and something goes wrong in the process. We don't want to just end the process. That's a lot of work that's happened. There's a lot of things that have been done and recorded. We need to make sure that there's a way that that process can get back on track after the error is resolved. If you just say, okay, cool, we've got an error, do the thing, end, the process is done because we hit an error, someone's going to be really angry when they find out that they have to do 9 months of work over again because the error handling in the process wasn't designed to allow the process to restart. So always think through what needs to happen to the process now that the error has been resolved. Do we restart it? Do we restart a particular section? Do we loop back to the very beginning of the process? Do we end the process? Do we go somewhere else in the process? There's a lot of things that can be done to help route the process where you need it to go, but always keep that in mind as you're developing and thinking about putting error handling into your process. Where does it need to go next? Now, one thing that we do have that the team has put together to kind of help get started with error handling, because we found every project that we deliver, we want to have error handling in, we've put together an error handling project to give us a baseline so that we can say, every time that we build a project, we shouldn't also have to build out a custom error handling application. So it has things like the dashboard that you see up here. I don't know if you can actually see it. It's very white on white. But it's got a lot of monitoring and some graphs that show you different projects have pushed data into the system over time. How many errors have been recorded in the last week, what errors are still open, what needs to be resolved, who is assigned to work those things. It's got assignments set up. It's got a data type that allows you to resolve those and record off the resolution to those things, and to give you that insight and monitoring without you having to build that yourself every single time. It's got notifications, pop-up notifications to the user, assigned forms. It's all there. This is something we're more than happy to share. If you would like to use this error handling process, we can get you an export of it. Just talk to your customer success manager. They don't know that I'm telling you to talk to them, so I will talk to them after this to let them know that people may be asking for it. But if you'd like to use it, we're happy to share. Plug it into your projects. But it's designed as decisions flows. So if you say, great, we have this starting point, we want our error handling to act differently, modify it, change it. This is the same thing we do with our professional services projects. We have a baseline. If the customer has specific ways they want this to operate, it's just another flow. We can change it to make it fit what they need, but it gives a good starting point without having to reinvent the wheel every single time. All right, if you recall, I said that there were 3 points to the build phase, the third one being code reviews. Code reviews and testing, the next big point, are actually being covered by Ben in the industry applications lessons learned. So if you want to hear more about code reviews, you want to hear more about testing, go sit in on Ben's session, and he will be talking all about that. But while I'm here, just a couple of things about code reviews and testing before I move on. Like I said, code reviews, there's a couple different ways that you want to approach that, what needs to be reviewed. First of all, reviewing the individual items, the flows that you've built from kind of a best practices standpoint. Do the flows make sense? Are they laid out well? Are the steps renamed? Are the lines organized well? Is the data name consistent across the flow? Are there any bad patterns in that particular flow? But I can build a flow that looks good as an individual flow and may not make sense in the context of the whole project, right? It may work well if I was going to say this flow does this thing and it does it one time. But if I put it into a project where I'm saying I'm bulk uploading 1 million records and it's going to run this piece 1 million times, maybe that flow doesn't make as much sense then. Maybe there's a different way that we need to design it. So reviewing the project level and saying, do all of the things in this project make sense together? And then finally, from an application level, do all of the different parts and functionalities that I'm building make sense in the context of the bigger application that I'm trying to develop? So just a couple things to keep in mind when you're designing your code review process and how you want to ensure that the things that you're building in Decisions are up to the standards that you want them to be. For testing, I'm just going to let Ben talk about testing. I'm going to move on to the next thing here. He will be covering all of that. All right, so you've built your project. You've done all of your development. You've tested your project. Everything is working the way that you want it to work. The next step is actually deploying the project that you've built. Now, as you're deploying your project, there's a lot more than just simply hitting export and then hitting import on another system. There's a lot to keep in mind here, right? We don't want to just take that project. We want to first validate that the thing that we've built, we have a good export package, that if I'm on the development server and I've built this thing and I've got it ready, that I can take that and give it to someone and they can expect to import that process without any issue. So we want to make sure that the package that we're putting together for them to import is actually going to import smoothly, right? Once we have that package together, we need to actually deploy it. We need to move it from one system into the next system. And then finally, we need to validate that the import itself has gone successfully. So there's a couple steps there, not just hit the export button, hit the import button. So let's start by talking about how do we validate that we have a good deployment package. The first thing, we've built everything. We say, this is ready to go. We've tested it. Take a look at the system for validation errors, right? Decisions will tell you, hey, you've got a bunch of flows that have unconnected steps. You've got data that's not mapped correctly. You have some problems with the components that you've built. They're probably not ready to be deployed yet. You may want to take a look at why this thing has validation issues. You can actually see it if you're logged into Decisions in the studio. It's right down at the bottom left corner, bottom left corner, thank you. Bottom left corner of the screen, you'll have this little icon that you can see right here, and you can see, hey, the system that I took the screenshot on has 15 validation errors. I need to investigate those before I say this thing is ready to deploy. The next part is to make sure that all of the components that belong to the project are actually tied to the project. Right? Typically, we can do this very easily by saying we've got all of the things that are going to be deployed in this project in this folder, tie that folder to the project, bring all of the things in the folder. But sometimes there's things that aren't going to be in that folder. For example, groups. If I've got groups that belong to this project and I need to migrate them over, I need to go and make sure that those groups are actually attached to the project. Things like CSS, integrations, database connections, folder permissions, these are all really easy to miss. So making sure that you have all of those things that belong to the project actually tied to the project so that when I deploy, I have everything that I need available to be part of that deployment. The next thing is making sure that any test data that I have isn't tied to the project. Depending on the type of data types that you're using in Decisions, those things may or may not be able to be tied to an export project. For example, simple database structures can't be tied to a project. The data exists only in a table in the database, it's not exportable through the decisions export process. Things like entities or process folders or folder extensions or case entities all live as things that are in the actual, like the folder entity table. There are things that can be tied to a project. So when you're setting up your project and you're telling it to automatically pull in everything in the folder, take a look and say, oh, is the test data that I've generated in this process, is it getting tied to the project when I don't want it to? If I've got a project that's creating process folders, I probably don't want all of the process folders that I've created through my testing to be deployed into production. That's all test data. It doesn't belong in production. So I want to make sure that those things aren't tied to the project. All of that data that gets generated as I'm working and building, it needs to stay in development. It's test data. It doesn't belong. It shouldn't be deployed. So making sure that those items are not tied to the project when I want to deploy. Things that I do want to include is configuration data. If I've got an entity that is a settings type file, if I've got data that is lookup list type of data, I've got an entity, I've got a table, and I can go to a folder and see all of the entities that are data that drive my process. These are things like I want to have a drop down, and here's the values that go into it, and I source them from an entity. That's configuration data that drives how the process works. It is part of the project, so I need to make sure that that data is included, because otherwise when I go to deploy, all of those things that are driven by that data aren't going to work correctly. So don't include test data, but do include configuration data. And finally, as part of this validation process, I recommend exporting the project and trying to import it somewhere. Like maybe not doing it in production because you're not actually ready to do the deployment yet. You're going to hand that off to someone. But taking that deployment package and importing it into a server and seeing, does it give me any issues? Does it say, hey, you're missing these 10 items. There's a bunch of dependencies that are missing. Or whatever those errors may be, validating that before I actually go to give this to someone to deploy, making sure that that package that I've put together works, and finding those issues and correcting them. If I deploy this on a test server and it says, hey, you're missing these 10 items, I can go back, find those items, add them to the project, validate that the project does now have everything that it needs to have, and so when I give that project to whoever's doing the deployment to production, they can be sure that the thing that they're going to import has everything that it needs and is going to import smoothly. So now we've got our deployment package together. We're ready to actually deploy. Right? So what do we need to do? First of all, we want to make sure that any modules that we're using as part of this are installed on the production system that we're deploying to. For example, this isn't an issue in 7 as much. In 6 and earlier, if you were using rule sets or flow sets, there was a module that had to be installed to make those work. In 7, we have that module installed for you automatically. But if you've got that kind of thing, or if you've got any custom things that need to be deployed, you've written your own custom code, you've got custom steps, you need to deploy those DLLs on the production server before you do that import. So making sure that any modules or any custom code has been deployed prior to trying to bring your flows over, because you'll get an issue on import that says, hey, we're missing these things. You've got some work to do before you can actually import this file. Bringing over project dependencies. We talked about splitting things up into multiple projects as you're working through an application. Sometimes those projects may have dependencies to other projects that you've built. If I build, in our HR example, if I'm building out the onboarding part, AJ is building out the payroll part, maybe those both reference a data type that is talking about an employee, right? Both of those things reference that same data. That's going to be a dependency between those projects. So if AJ is ready to deploy payroll, and I'm building the onboarding part, and the employee is part of my project, I need to make sure that those dependencies are on the server I'm deploying to before I can complete that import. Otherwise, I'm going to have issues. All of AJ's items, all of his flows that reference my employee data type aren't going to work properly because the employee data type doesn't exist there. So making sure that any project dependencies are also moved to the system where you're doing the import. Finally, here's the step where we actually move this thing over. We've got our export that we've taken from our development server, or we've checked that item into the repository, and we're saying it's time to go. We're doing the deployment. We want to import that data or check it out from the repository. This is actually the smoothest part of the process, assuming that all of the other steps have been followed, right? We've already made sure that we've got all the dependencies, we've got all of that together. All we need to do is bring that thing into the production system. Now, as you're doing that import, you may find that you have issues. Decisions will tell you, hey, there's a problem during the import. You need to resolve these things in some way. The main things that we see here are either missing dependencies or newer changes on production. There's other issues that you can see, but these are kind of the top two that people will see as they're deploying. The first one, the missing dependencies, should have already been identified. If you're following all of the other steps, this one shouldn't be a problem because you've already figured out what things you need to have before bringing that over. For newer changes on production, the solution here is you shouldn't be making changes to your flows in production. If this is an issue that you're seeing during import, there's a whole other problem. Any changes that you're making to flows should be happening in development, getting tested, and getting deployed. If you're making changes directly on your production system, there's likely going to be other issues that are occurring because now you have untested things that are just happening live in production and could be causing you a lot of problems. So both of these two main issues can be mitigated by following the process and making sure that you're taking each one of those steps. Finally, resolve any import issues. Wait, no, that's the step that I'm on right now. That is what you need to do to deploy. After you've deployed, here's the finally. Validating the import, right? Check the system validations again. Decisions will give you a report of import issues. If you go to System, Administration, System Tools, Validation Issues, you can get a report. It'll give you any system-level validation issues, but there's also a tab for import issues and give you a record of here are things that have gone wrong that you want to address that happened during the import, right? So check the system validation. See if there's anything that you need to resolve there. Check code compile results. If you're bringing in new data types, you're bringing in things that are actually going to cause a compile in decisions, check to make sure that that code has compiled correctly, that your data types are working correctly. And finally, check for noisy logs. Go look at the logs page and see, I've done this import. Am I suddenly getting a burst of logs reporting errors on this project that I've just imported? If you are, there's a good chance that either something's gone wrong in the import or there's an issue with the project itself that you've brought over. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the last section on validating. But take a look at the logs right after the import and see, is there any indication that something has gone really badly and the logs are just filling up with errors directly following my import? Has something gone catastrophically wrong? All right, that takes us to step 4 of the overall deployment cycle, validate. Just because I've migrated a project from dev into production doesn't mean it's the end of the deployment. That thing is there. It can be used, it's running, but it's critical to validate that the process is now working as you expect it to work, right? There's a couple of things that we can do here. One, validating from an end user perspective. Are users still able to use the system as we expect them to? Is it still working properly? Are they finding things that we missed during testing? Are there errors that are occurring? They can't submit their forms anymore. The process just isn't working. The process is not working as expected. What's going on? But having good feedback loops to allow your users to report when things aren't working as expected so you can find them early and mitigate those problems, right? Next, keeping analytics of post-deployment stability. Monitoring the system to see what is happening from both a data level and from a performance level of what's going on with the system. I've just deployed this new set of flows. Is the system suddenly crashing? Is my CPU spiking? Am I using all of my memory when I wasn't before? Find out what's going on there. and do some analytics and record some data. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about inspecting the process for errors to see if something has gone wrong. All right, so talking about feedback loops for users. The key here is training your users on upcoming changes to the product, right? If I've made changes to UI, I've made changes to what's happening behind the scenes, making sure that users understand how their experience is going to change as a result of the things that I've just deployed, right? Kind of plotted here, we've got the difference between a process that has a very high number of users versus a high complexity of the process. If you've got a process where we've got a lot of people just doing data entry, it's probably not a really complex process, but it's probably a process that we've got hundreds and hundreds of people all running the same process at the same time over and over again, versus a really complicated process where maybe we have one person that's running this 2 times a day, but it's very involved. There's quite a bit of training in that process that's involved in them being able to actually run it and understanding the process and thinking through where your process fits into here to help drive the training that you're giving to your users so they understand, hey, we've just added a new form in here, or we've removed a form from the process to help streamline it, that you don't get 100 emails saying, hey, yesterday when we ran through the process, we had 5 forms to fill out. We're missing a form today. What happened? Like, if your users don't know that the process has been moved to 4 forms, and you've got 1,000 people running this form 1,000 times a day, you're going to be getting a lot of complaints that the process doesn't work anymore because they're missing a form, right? So making sure that before you do the deployment, your users understand the changes to the process and what to expect post-deployment will help them be able to communicate to you if something actually is working unexpectedly. Not just to help alleviate if something isn't working or a place where they think something isn't working that is, but to help them understand, hey, this thing should be doing something else now. If it's not doing that, we need you to let us know so that we can go look at why it's not doing that, right? So how do you make sure that your users understand what the process is so that they can tell you if something's not working as expected? And then how do you build ways for your users to actually communicate that information to you? Out of the box is a really easy one. If you ever go click on the little About tab, there's a Submit Feedback right there. And it gives you this form, and it's a very basic form, but you can customize it if you need to, that they can put in information here, give you some notes. There is a setting in the decision settings that lets you give it an email address where it's going to send this information. But you can say, hey, as you're using this, we're rolling out changes. Come in here, submit feedback. That's like an easy out-of-the-box win. You don't even have to build anything. If you want a more thorough process to kind of track that information, record it, be able to report on it, absolutely build. You can build something in Decisions that gives you that ability. But if you just say, hey, we want something, use that submit feedback. It's there. It's useful. And there's no work that's needed to really get that thing rolling. You can automatically be getting, or very easily be getting, feedback from your users about what the process is doing, if it should be doing something differently. Analytics, right? We want to make sure that we've deployed the process. We want to ensure a couple of things, right? There could be a number of reasons why we're doing a deployment. We are adding in new functionality. We want to change how the process works. Sometimes we're doing a deployment because we need to improve performance. How do we know that we've improved performance if we don't have a record of what the performance was prior to the deployment? Or how do we know that we've deployed something that's new functionality? How do we know that it's not making our performance much worse if we don't know what our performance was before we deployed? So we recommend recording metrics around what the system is doing. Things like CPU usage, memory usage, the number of rules or flows that are running. Decisions will record a lot of this stuff for you. But having a way to monitor that so that post-deployment you can compare how is the system running before we deployed, how's the system running after we deployed, and monitor this in a span of time following the deployment. How does it look an hour after we deployed? How does it look the next day? How does it look a week from now? How does it look 30 days from now? but making sure that we have that data to track over time how the process is running and how that changes after we've done a deployment. Terry?
Do you have any pre-built projects that do that right now that you can share? Or?
I do not currently, no. But monitoring this data, and some of this I don't know that it would probably be done external to decisions for things like CPU usage, memory usage, and recording that. But building up that record, right? And not just system utilization to record, but record how data flows through. This is going to be very project specific, but recording, number of times that a call has been made into the system, or what kind of data has been processed by the system. Do we suddenly see a shift in how the system itself is behaving? Right? Monitoring these errors. If you're using that error handling project that we talked about, right? You can go in there and see over time the number of errors that have been being introduced by the system. And so you can say, okay, well, we had the project running. We had, on average, 2 exceptions occurred every week for the past 4 weeks. We've deployed this, and now we see that the number of errors per week has gone down to 0, right? That's a good metric. We can see deploying this has improved the process. Or inversely, we've deployed this, and we see that suddenly the number of errors has jumped up to 10 errors a day consistently over time. We can look at that and see those metrics are something has gone wrong when we've deployed this. We're suddenly seeing a lot more errors coming to the system, and we're seeing that consistently over time compared to what we were seeing before the deployment. So making sure that you have a way to measure how things are operating before a deployment and how things are operating after a deployment and how those things compare. And then finally, validating by inspecting the process for errors. The key here is understanding what the process is. What is the process meant to do? What are the states that it should go through? How long does it take to run? What does the data look like? Keeping in mind here, right, there's kind of 2 kinds of errors that can occur in a process. You've got your general exceptions. Something has gone wrong. A flow step has failed to run. And these are all things that are caught by a catch exception step. These are recorded in the error handling. Something failed to operate the way that it was meant to operate. But there's another class of errors that can happen, right? This is something where the process is not working as it's expected. I've done some development. I've got a rule in my process that checks to see if a user's age is over 18. And I've accidentally swapped my true and false paths. So I've wired the true to what should be false, and I've wired the false to the true. That's not going to throw an exception. The process itself is going to run. Decisions is going to say, this flow executed correctly. But my process isn't working. My process is not working as it's meant to. The process is in an exception state because now it's routing incorrectly. So being able to monitor what the process is supposed to do, if I know that when it's in state A, and I put in this data, I can look at the data that's flowing through the system. I know that it should be going to state B, and it's actually going to state C. Something's wrong with my process. I've deployed a flow that is not working correctly. So it's really important to understand what is the process, what's it meant to do, how long is it meant to take, what should the data be, so that I can compare that against what's actually happening in the process. I can compare that against the feedback that I'm getting from the users. I can compare that against the metrics that I've been collecting about how the process is running, and say, is the process actually doing what I want it to do? Or is it doing something different? Am I getting a lot of errors or exceptions being thrown from steps failing? Am I getting a lot of errors because the process is running in a way that the process is not meant to be running? And validating that. And like I said, don't just do it the day that you deploy. Deploy it, do your validations, check again a week later. Is the process still running as expected? Are there things that take longer than just a single day or a couple hours to get to that part of the flow? Are things working a week from now? Are things working a month from now? Follow that deployment through, validate over time. The more closely you inspect the process, the more closely you validate the process, reduces the chances that 6 months from now, someone is going to come and say, hey, we just realized the process isn't working correctly. It hasn't been working correctly from the last 6 months. We've got 6 months of bad data. We've got 6 months of data that got lost somehow because the process wasn't saving it the way that we thought. Now you've got 6 months of data reconciliation that you have to deal with, as opposed to, hey, we deployed this, something went wrong, we found it. We realized early that the process wasn't working as expected. That's the deployment process. All the way starting from building with deployment in mind, building around those best practices, building that error handling, building those code reviews, testing the process, making sure that things work the way that you expect them to work, deploying the process, migrating the code from development all the way into production, and finally validating that after you've deployed, the system is working the way that you expect it to work. If you've got any questions, things that you want to know more about, if you want to get a copy of that error handling project, reach out to your customer success manager, and they will be able to help get you that information. Any questions before we end? It looks like we're right at 9:45 and time for the break, but if anybody's got any quick questions, happy to answer. All right, well, we've got 2 other sessions, so enjoy the rest of your day.